some conversations with Parker Palmer, with Richard Rohr, and other people as well. So we're pleased to have interest in this program from around the world. We have over 1,200 subscribers from people who've joined us from more than 30 countries. And today we're really grateful to have with us Lou Nanne. But before I introduce Lou, I just want to give you a couple technical details. First, you're muted now by the host to facilitate a conversation without background noise. But we will have a question and answer session later in the program. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it through the chat feature on this webcast. Also, we recommend that you use Speaker View in Zoom, as this will highlight our speakers as they come on the screen. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lou. And Lou, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Father Dan.
Thanks, Lou. Lou's been a personal friend for many years. In fact, we date back probably more than 35 years. And he's now Vice President for University Relations here at Notre Dame. And in his role, he oversees the university's efforts in development, advisory councils, special events, and Notre Dame Alumni Association. So there's a more extensive bio of Lou's accomplishments that can be viewed on our website, heartsdesireandsocialchange.com. But in brief, Lou, what's amazing about Lou is that he has kind of spanned such a wide range of activities and interests. And looking at the core amidst those interests, I think is going to be one of the fascinating parts of this conversation. But for 8 years, he served as the executive director of the Center for the Homeless in South Bend. And he established the center as a national model that addresses the complex issues related to homelessness. And as a leading authority on these issues, he even addressed Congress during its debate on welfare reform measures and led training sessions for thousands of community service workers across North America. All the while, he formed close personal relationships and really respected the dignity and the value of each person who came to that place as guests. Lou is a graduate from Notre Dame in 1984, and he received a BA in government and the program of liberal studies. And following graduation, he served as a lay missioner in the shantytown of Santiago, Chile, with the Holy Cross Associates. And he also entered Notre Dame's Peace Studies program in its first year in 1988. So Lou, there's a lot more to talk about here, but we want to get into the conversation with you. But thanks again for joining us.
No, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Father Dan.
So Lou, take us back a little bit to your family and how you grew up, and what were some of the values and perspectives that really became instilled in you during your growing up years?
You know, first of all, I just want to thank you, and I'm really honored, and I'm a little bit incredulous that I'm one of the guests with the other amazing people that you have on this series called The Heart's Desire. In fact, it reminds me of the old, I have 5 kids, right? So it reminds me of the old Sesame Street song where it says, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. I feel like the one that doesn't belong in the list of candidates. But I grew up in Western New York in a very small town between Buffalo and Rochester. I was the oldest of 4 kids. My dad was a school teacher who became a primary, secondary school administrator. My mom ran the school credit union out of their bedroom, and then it moved when I got to be older down into the basement of our house. So we always had phone calls coming in for withdrawals and deposits and so forth onto the main phone of our house. So she took care of us and worked a job at the same time, like a lot of people have been doing, quite frankly, during the pandemic with young kids, and just grew up with an amazing set of parents. And we never felt like we wanted for anything, but we didn't really take vacations. I didn't fly in a plane until after my sophomore year of college, and when I came out here to Notre Dame, it was the furthest west I'd ever been, and so we lived in a small world. Growing up, but it was a rich and it was a beautiful world, and the values that were transmitted were great. Came to Notre Dame, had a wonderful experience, opened my eyes to so much, and including the powerful witness of Holy Cross priests who had just a big influence on my life. And as I went through that discernment process, I thought, I want to do service. I want to be engaged. I want to live more on the margins. And it opened up decisions like going off to Chile as a Holy Cross associate for 2.5 years upon graduation.
So before going down to Chile and why you went down there and what you learned down there, tell us a little bit about sort of your undergraduate studies. And you were a great books major in the program of liberal studies,
Yeah.
and you spent a lot of time in small seminars, discussing some of the great works of civilization. Did that influence the questions you asked and the searching at that time in your life?
Believe it or not, Dan, you're also a PLS grad, so you know this really well. I so value that major, and it did force me to ask questions at a deeper level than I think I would have otherwise. And one of the questions that really kind of persisted with me was, are we progressing as a human civilization over time? And most of the great philosophers that I read um, suggested that we were not, that human beings were in a state of war, and that you needed governments and regulations to try to bring out the best in them, and that we weren't progressing. And when I graduated, uh, I wanted to go and try to explore that question of my own. And are we getting better? I wanted us as a civilization to learn from our mistakes, to treat others more humanely, to be more inclusive, and to have justice prevail. And so it was something I wanted to explore on the first hand, and beyond books, to get out and displace myself on multiple levels to a new world, and to begin to understand not only answers to that question, but what was my view of God? What was my prayer life, when so much to that day my prayer were prayers of gratitude? And then I asked myself the question, what happens if I didn't have anything? What happens if I were living in a shanty town where people didn't have enough to eat, that they were cold and defenseless against the elements? Would I still find gratitude for God? And how would that reshape my spirituality and my thinking? Because so many in the world, more people live like the people in the shanty towns of Chile than were living like I did in the United States. So those were some of the questions that I really wanted to pursue.
So, Lou, it's real common, as you know, with students who are entering into those last years of their undergraduate career here, of really trying to make choices about where they want to go. You had a lot of options in front of you.
Yeah.
What made you go down to Chile, and how hard of a decision was that to make?
Well, yeah, it was it. I had worked 2 summers in the on the Hill, and for a U.S. senator, and then I had a top internship on a U.S. presidential campaign when I was a student here at Notre Dame. And I can remember myself bold and ambitious, thinking I'm going to get elected to the U.S. Congress by the age of 30. And the second summer I was in D.C., it really hit me, and I said, everybody comes with big aspirations about how they want to serve. But when they get into this world, it becomes more about one's own self advancement, self aggrandizement. What do I have to do to move up the ladder to position myself? And I realized, I'm no different than everybody else. People begin with good intentions, but they become co opted or corrupted along the way. And I thought I needed a groundedness. I needed a groundedness and a God centeredness and an other centeredness that would provide a foundation that would allow me to do whatever I chose to do, whether it be public service or another area of profession. I could do it with a different foundation, a different base. And so I decided that I looked and talked to a lot of people. I discerned the decision more than, and church is so good about helping you understand the difference between decision making and discerning a call. And the levels of discernment over the course of my junior and senior year are really providential as I look to them in retrospect. But the call of I wanted to learn a second language, and I wanted to be a language that I could use for the rest of my life. I wanted to live among the poorest of the poor. in the world and to see what the world would look like from there. I wanted to go to a third world or developing country and see my own country from their perspective and the rest of the world. I wanted to see what it would be like to live under a dictatorship, under a state of siege. What would it be like if I didn't have the same privileges that I take for granted growing up in the United States? And many other layers of that discernment took me to Chile and took me to the Holy Cross Associate Program, and challenged me. Most times in life, Dan, you get to somebody will walk you up to a high diving board, right? And you get those jitters in your stomach, and you get up there, and they say, "Okay, just jump. It'll be fine. Just jump." And and then you jump and you hit the water, and you say, "Oh my God, it wasn't that bad." But there's a few times in life when you get up there and you jump, and then after you hit the water, you say, "Okay, I'll never do that again." You know, that Chile was a little bit like that. It was a lot more than I ever imagined. It was more spiritually disruptive and emotionally challenging than I had ever imagined. Mark Twain said, about young people, he said, if you have confidence and ignorance, success is virtually assured. And I had a lot of confidence and had way more ignorance, and I struggled. I struggled through the Chile experience. It scarred me for life, but it gave me the foundation that I am forever grateful for. When I came back after 2.5 years, I remember saying to my parents, and I remember I was emotional, and I said, I I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, but I feel like I've lived a lifetime in the last 2.5 years. I've seen a lot of suffering, I've seen death, and I've seen a lot of despair. And I said, I don't know where I'm going in my life, but I know what's important. And I'm fully, grateful for that, formative experience alongside the Congregation of Holy Cross.
Well, let's stay with that for a moment. Just what you learned while you were in Chile. So you graduated in '84. After that, you went down to Chile. Chile was still in the midst of a dictatorship under Pinochet at that time. There were a
Yeah,
lot of human rights violations, including some of which happened to people connected to the communities you worked in.
right.
Uh, what what did you learn during that time, and what values do you think became galvanized in your own heart and soul?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. Five of my high school students, I taught at a poor school and I taught in a wealthy prep school. Five of my students were tortured during the time I was there. Every Saturday, I visited a women political prisoners, about 30 in a gymnasium, all of whom had been systematically tortured for about 5 days on end. They were blindfolded and they were raped repeatedly by their torturers. One of the women in the prison was carrying in her womb the anonymous child of a torturer. And I got to be very close to these women, and it in the shanty town, the level of despair, being able to break the cycle of making it out of that shanty town was almost nil. And so the first year that I was there, Dan, I would say that I hit a deep level of despair. I lost God. I lost hope. I lost any confidence in myself to be able to change the suffering of so many in this world. And I would go to bed at night and I would cry for Christ crucified and the people. And I also was really disappointed in myself because I was discovering that I wasn't going to be the next Mother Teresa. I wasn't going to be the next Martin Luther King Jr. And so it was a very humbling, overwhelming experience. I was numbed most of all by the indifference of the masses. That once my eyes were opened, how could how could people like this, 40,000 children die a day of malnutrition, as was the statistic back then, and it's not that much better. It is a little better today, but in a world where the grain supply is enough to meet everybody's nutritional needs 1.5 times over, how can there be so much indifference and greed relative to the needs that were out there? And that indifference kind of numbed my soul. But the second year I was there, I found hope. And I found hope where I least expected to find it. I learned that hope doesn't come in numbers, but hope comes in the authenticity of an example. And I realized then that the mother who's learned that two neighborhoods over some kid was tortured and tortured to death, who went out to protest publicly, knowing full well that she could widow her own children in the process, or orphan, I should say, her own children in the process, or the family of my eighth grade students that would invite me into their shanty house that was built like the way a bird builds a nest with various and sundry parts, and they would serve hot dogs. And then one of the younger kids would inadvertently say, "This is the first time we've ever eaten meat." And I would realize the profundity of the gift, the depth of the sacrifice that they were making to make this gringo feel comfortable in their very humble abode. And there I experienced a hope, and I experienced this belief that they were going to leave those common day prophets, those authentic examples of sacrifice and goodness and generosity. They were going to leave a more indelible impression on my soul than all of the masses and all of the numbers. And I also realized that each and every one of us, including myself, has the ability at any given moment to rise above our human frailties and limitations and testify to a love that is greater than us all. And wow, that's powerful.
It's beautiful, Lou. You know, one of the things we talk about in the course is foundational experiences, and it's clear Chile was that kind of foundational experience for you. It
Yeah,
galvanized certain things that were important to you. And then as you come back 2.5 years later, these stories, these people, these memories are still very much present to you. So you had to make some decisions coming back, not just to go down to Chile, but also
right.
coming back. What was the discernment like as you really went into that process of decision making, and how did that lead you into your next step?
If you do kind of, as Mary Knoll and others have kind of done psychological kind of charts of cross-cultural overseas missioners, the hardest part is always coming back. That's when people kind of think it's hard to kind of assimilate into that foreign culture at first, but it's a deeper dip typically on the psychological spectrum, spiritual spectrum, when it comes to returning home. And there's this tendency, you're trying to fight between these two worlds, right? On the one hand, you don't want to forget. You don't want to forget the people who have shaped and formed you and have touched you so deeply, and you don't want to sell them out. You don't want to come back and fit in too easily and be comfortable. And yet, on the other hand, you're trying to say, accept people for where they're at. They haven't been exposed to what you've been exposed. Don't be so harsh. Don't be judgmental. And at any moment you feel like I'm too far here or too far there, and you really wrestle, and you become a part of more than one culture, and you realize the relative power of culture. And what it does is it heightens your sense of loneliness. As you know, you're never fully at home in one culture. There's always a part of you that doesn't quite fit in. And so within its challenges, one of my favorite books through the Great Books program was Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And there's that moment when the elder, Father Zosima, is giving counsel to the protagonist, Alyosha, as he's leaving the seminary to go out into the world. And his final advice to a student who admires him and loves him so dearly is, he says to him, find joy in suffering. And there's that peace there, that out of that brokenness, out of that loneliness, out of that searching comes something so beautiful. Comes a depth of love, and a way to kind of give yourself, and a depth of empathy that doesn't come if your life is easy and goes smoothly. I mean, that in Graham Greene's novel, if you got some really deep sins to confess, you want to find that old whiskey priest, the one who knows alcoholism and brokenness and hardship, because that person will understand. And so Albert Schweitzer talked about the fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. And when you know pain, other people will sense it, and they'll come to you and they'll share their heart's longings, their heart's desires, and you're open to a whole new world that you didn't even know existed.
It's so true, Lou. I often ask students to like watch where your heart breaks,
Yeah,
to really look at those experiences to where your heart breaks, because that's going to also be revelatory of where you're being called to live. And there's a lot I want to explore in that because there's so much there, Lou.
yeah.
But I don't want to skip over just some also very important moments in your life and your journey when you came back from Chile. You were in the first class when Father Hesburgh started the International Peace Studies program, where you got together with people from around the world who were also coming from war-torn areas. What was it like to be thrown into a setting like this, where for the first time you were trying to figure out how to make peace out of a war-torn world in a very microcosmic way?
I mean, it was a great follow-up to Chile. First, I was able to have the space and time to study many of the problems that I had experienced viscerally, emotionally, firsthand, and it gave kind of a depth of experience and insight. And I was able to be mentored by a number of people who helped me to process my own story and understand it in deeper ways. But there were 13 of us from 8 different countries, right? So we struggled to build a meaningful community and connection at first. We did not have a common religion. We did not have a common political tradition. We barely had a common language. We came from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. So what brought us together? What was our commonality? Our strengths separated us, but what brought us together was our brokenness, our weaknesses. Everybody there knew failure at some level. Everybody there knew loneliness. Everyone there at some level had experienced rejection. So when we could strip away all that separated us and come into the raw community of our own brokenness, our own vulnerability, there we were able to connect. And we had to write a communal thesis as to what we felt were the necessary steps at the end of our time together to work toward a more just and peaceful world. And what I realized in that process is that people did not so much seek to be agreed with. We had all different perspectives, but they really sought to be understood. And that if you could really listen attentively to another from a different background, and even if you disagreed in the end, but if that person felt understood, our common humanity was furthered, and goodwill was advanced across the board. It was an important but simple, takeaway for me.
So Lou, you took all those experiences in Chile and peace studies, trying to build community, trying to really figure out what it means to journey together. And you didn't just sort of transition easily into a conventional space after that. You took on a very difficult assignment of first going to Orlando to work for World Mission with the Diocese of Orlando. And then you came back and were for 8 years the director of the Center for the Homeless, especially in some of those very formative years in the beginning.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about those experiences, especially at the Center for the Homeless, and what was it like to work there?
Yeah. No, the Dominican Republic was a fascinating experience because I was there most of the time, and the bishop there had said, listen, we're a wealthy diocese in Orlando, Florida. We want to partner with a really poor diocese because we can learn and grow from each other. So I coordinated that relationship with the Diocese of San Juan de la Maguana, which is along the Haitian border, and spent a lot of time there. And it was a rural experience where my experience of poverty in Chile was urban. So it was very different, and it was a kind of a fascinating study, comparing one to the other. But when I was in the Dominican Republic, I was listening and reading a lot about Mother Teresa, and I remember she said that poverty in the United States is worse than poverty in a third world context. She says because poverty at its deepest level, it's not about just wanting for a home and for food and in shelter, et cetera. She said it's when you feel rejected, when you feel like an outcast, when you feel isolated. And the point that she was making is in the US versus many parts of the world, if you're poor, it's deemed that somehow you have brought this upon yourself. That in this land of wealth, if you are poor, you are somehow responsible. You're at fault. You're lazy, or you're a derelict in some ways. And so I wanted to experience that. I did not know much about poverty in my own country, in my own backyard. And I had spent 5 years living in Latin America at that point, and it was time for my eyes to be opened and working with the homeless. And I went to work at the Center for the Homeless because I felt like I needed them in my life even more than they needed me. And that was the mission behind the center. It wasn't that the homeless just needed the community, but the community needed to be in touch with its most marginalized citizens. And so we really felt that by bringing people together, they could discover each other's worth, self-dignity, and God-given potential. And that was the fundamental mission. I'll tell you a quick story. Then I knew nothing about homelessness. Here I am in late 20s. I was the 5th executive director in the first 2 years that the place was open, and nobody had lasted more than 6 months. The place was, a couple $100,000 in debt, and it was a mess, I would just say. And I didn't know if I was going to make it more than 6 months. And certainly the reason why I got the job is everybody else was smarter not to apply for it, so I didn't even know what I was walking into. And I could tell you war stories that we could laugh about now, but you certainly weren't laughing about then. And I met this woman one day. I'm like, I don't think I'm going to make it. And I stopped at the Burger King in downtown South Bend, and I had a magazine with me, and she saw me, and she threw her hands up in the air, and she said, "Oh, Brother Lou, hasn't the Lord blessed us with this chance occasion?" And I knew her. She was a guest at the center. I'd been there a month, and she was a chronically mentally ill middle-aged lady. And she would oftentimes speak in tongues, which I mistook as French my second week, which was incredibly embarrassing. And yet she was passionate. And before she left Burger King, this crowded Burger King, she took the lid off of the top of my large Sprite. And, she went to pour the Sprite over the top of my head in front of everybody. And I said, no, Stan, no, and stop. And, she laughed and she said, "Oh, Brother Lou, you must trust more in the Lord." So I'm thinking, okay, everybody laughed about the story. The next day, at the end of the day at work, she knocks on my door and she said, "Brother Lou, do you have a moment?" I said, "I sure do, Ann." It was always really pleasing to be with her. And she said, "I want to explain a few things about the baptism we almost had at Burger King yesterday." And I said, "Okay, Ann, I'm sure I could use the clarification." And then she said this. She goes, "The Lord, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit was speaking through me to you. And the Holy Spirit was not necessarily telling me to pour that cup." And she goes, "That was a large drink you got, wasn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, and that was large." And she said, "What the Holy Spirit was telling you is that this cup will not pass you by." And I was stunned, and it took me aback. And then I thought, wow, how woefully shallow is my faith that I could be surprised that a chronically mentally ill, middle-aged homeless woman would be bringing words of hope and consolation to a young upstart executive director. Because the prophets in our tradition have always come from the margins. They're the people who have had the least vested in society, and in their brokenness have been able to receive the word of God and all of its power and truth and beauty and reveal that to others. Why should I be surprised? And so the reason why I felt called to be on the margins is because I need to be there more than they even need me.
Well, you're talking about that kind of sense of accompaniment and actually meeting people where they're at and actually embracing the poor where they're at and actually seeing it as a common journey, not just, somebody helping from the top down.
Right.
And yet to make a kind of a shift in our conversation, you've actually gone from the margins to coming here to Notre Dame to lead the development office and to really raise billions of dollars for the university, which really has required you to be among some of the wealthiest of the world. So what's it like for you to change social location from working among the poorest of the world to working among some of the wealthiest of the world, and what helped keep you grounded? Well,
let me start out before I get into that. What helps keep you grounded? I have an incredible wife and 5 children. The 5 children for a long period of time became my homeless center. They became the chaos, and you'd love nothing more than your children. And at times it feels like there's nothing that you love more that you have less control over, right? So just trying to kind of manage a household together with my wife, and I'll never forget, there was a woman that we were trying to hire early on at Notre Dame, from the California area, and we had a mutual friend who was a nun, and and this woman asked the nun. She said, "I'm thinking of coming back and working for Lou Nanne." She said, um, "What is one of the most insightful questions I've ever heard?" She goes, "What is his wife like?" She said, "Well, she's a really strong woman. You know, she lets him have it, and she keeps him, in line and everything else like that." And this woman said, "Good, because I don't think I could ever work for a man again who marries a weak woman." And so one of the great things for me is I'm married to this incredible woman who cuts me no slack. And she'll tell me if we've been out someplace, if I've talked too long, and if I didn't listen attentively, or if I was too dismissive to this or that. And we've got the 5 kids, and they keep you grounded, they keep you humbled, through their struggles and their joys. They take you, just when you start to think like a little something about life, they take you down paths you never expect to go. And that's been beautiful. They become, a way that really keeps me grounded. And they don't care what I do. They don't care how much money I raise. We don't talk about that at home. Those aren't issues. And so I feel very blessed by the family that I'm surrounded with. To me, the work that I do now is, what is the mission of Notre Dame? To me, it's never about the money. It's always about the mission. And the mission of Notre Dame is to try to take really talented and hardworking students, to receive them and to help develop their God-given potential to the very fullest, intellectually, emotionally, physically, spiritually, socially, for one primary reason: that when they graduate, as they will another class here in the next few weeks, they will go forth to transform the jangling discord of this world into a more harmonic symphony. They will make an impact by the careers that they choose, by leading lives of excellence, integrity, and service, but just as importantly, by being good husbands and wives, mothers, fathers, priests, nuns, whatever their personal calling might be, to lead lives of integrity and service. And, and that, to me, is leaven for a society that is deeply, deeply in need. And we at Notre Dame have to ask ourselves every day, 6% of the world's population has a college degree. What are we doing to make ourselves inclusive of the other 94%? And that question better be a question that we ask daily. How are we making ourselves relevant to a world that is deeply in need, not just through our graduates, but through our research and by the example that we are as an institution? And I find that eminently worthwhile, a mission to serve. And it's about educating the next generation of leaders. It's about being that example, and it's about pioneering research that brings greater hope and beauty and healing to a world that is desperately looking for it.
Well, Lou, talking about the formal education that we offer here at school, but also the informal education you get at home, I want to ask you to just recall a story that I heard you give at a graduation speech some time ago when your son was sort of in angst over being punished for something that he did. I think you know the story I'm talking about. I wonder if you could just help us understand what it was like for you to learn as a parent, what it was like to love your child, especially after you did something wrong.
Yeah, no, thanks for reminding me of that story. I just left the homeless center, and after 8+ years, of working with people on the streets, you kind of get, you feel like you've been toughened up a little bit. And, a big part of that work is trying to find a way to get to the truth. And people are able to lie very convincingly because the stakes are so high, right? I'm going to be put back out into the streets. I might die. I might be raped. And so I felt like I'd been toughened up. I had some level of street sense, and I just started working at Notre Dame. I'd been at Notre Dame for about 3 months or so, and I came home, and the three kids at the time were 6, 4, and 2. And I go to the bathroom, on the first floor, and there's a brand new roll of toilet paper in the bowl, soaking wet. So I say, kids, I said, who did this? Nobody had done it, right? Nobody had done it. And I was like, okay, now I tried to find out who did it. And I cannot crack my 6-year-old and my 4-year-old. I'm thinking, oh my God, has Notre Dame softened me this quickly that I couldn't, get through the truth? And it got to be kind of an ego thing. And they all tried to convince me that the 2-year-old, had done it, and she couldn't really speak for herself, but I knew she didn't quite have the dexterity. And finally, after 15, 20 minutes of all about me, I can't believe I can't get to the truth. My son out of nowhere said to me, I could just see him cracking a little bit. And he said, if I did it, will I still be your son? And I looked at him and I said, what? And that son is a senior at Notre Dame right now. And he said, Dad, he goes, I know that you guys just, he's 4 years old. And I had no idea he picked up on this. You guys just hired a football coach and you found out that basically he lied. He had misrepresented himself on his resume and you guys fired him. If I did this, will I be removed from the family? And I realized he was able to be so convincing in his lie because in his mind, the stakes were exceedingly high. And it changed my parenting at that day. It changed it to the point where on a regular basis, putting the kids to bed, I say to them, you know that I love you just as much as you win as when you lose. You know that I love you just as much when you behave well as when you behave poorly. You know that I love you just as much, the highs and lows of life. That doesn't change. That same unconditional love that God shows to us, to be able to provide that safety to your children and to reiterate that. So in times, and I would say to them, when I get angry, when I yell, my love for you has not changed. And that moment taught me that, and I embraced that kid and, grateful for that learning.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Lou, is to just hear the different ways you learn through the different aspects of your life. And, we only have time for one more question that I'm going to be asking here, but I want to open it up to the questions of our listeners today. But I think, Lou, one of the things we're doing in this podcast is to really highlight the things that matter. And so as you look at the learning that you've done through your formal education, through your service opportunities, as well as through your work here now in the development office, what is the stuff deep down in the core of your heart that says, these are the things that matter, and these are the things I really want to keep, really in the forefront of my life and my vision?
It's a great question, Dan, and I don't know how to answer it without sounding too cliche, and I don't want that to be there. But one of the things that we do, and you can't really see it up here on the wall, is I've got a wall of like several hundred funeral cards, and I think this kind of embodies, the answer with an anecdote, is that so many people and, that you're close to, and, they die. The older we get, there's so many funerals, and the funerals always come in without much notice, right? You get 2 days or 3 days, how I'm going to get to this part of the country or that part of the country, especially with this broad Notre Dame family. And there's always good reasons why not to go. There's always reasons, this meeting and that, and I can't extract myself and this and that. But when you show up and you get there and you walk through the doors of that funeral home or into that church, people will pause and say, oh my God, I can't believe this person made it there, or Notre Dame's here. You realize that you're representing something so much bigger than yourself. And nothing is more meaningful and nothing will be forgotten when you show up for somebody else in a time of need. There's ways for us to be there in these relationships in times of great joy, right? We go to weddings, we go to graduations, to baptisms, to first communions, to baseball games and other great sporting events. but to make the time to be there for somebody else in a time of need, to show up, it says a lot. And I'll never forget, the people that came to my father's funeral when he died at a relatively young age. You don't forget that, and it leaves an impression on your soul. So for me, it would be show up, make the time, be there for others, especially in when they're going through trying and difficult times, because that's when it's needed most.
Yeah, it's so true, Lou. I mean, so often we get stuck on accomplishing, producing, organizing, but in the end, it's about relationships. And I think when I was a young seminarian and I was working as a hospital chaplain, I can remember working with heart attack and cancer patients, and how much I would ask people, what they learned from the span of their lifetime before they died, and they often said it's relationships, relationships, relationships.
Yeah.
But relationships, I want to transition a little bit into some of the questions from our listeners here today. And one of the questions really is related to relationships, and it's a topic that you touched upon, and that is vulnerability. I think this is a thing that often to succeed and often even to get into a place like this, people have to show their accomplishments and their successes. It's not as straightforward as to talk about vulnerability, but without that vulnerability, it's not possible to really form those relationships. So one of our listeners asks if you can expand a little bit more on the importance and the value of showing vulnerability as a leader.
I think that's a really insightful question, and I think there's an answer already to the question. I think it's essential as a leader, and it goes back to the comment that I made about the Peace Studies year, that what connects us is our brokenness. It connects us is our vulnerability. Some people are great singers. Some people are tech wizards. Others can be great orators. Some others are great writers. Whatever it might be, our strengths separate us. But we all know vulnerability. And as a leader, I think it's essential to be a wounded healer, in a sense, to quote a Henry Nouwen book, to share your wounds with others, to share that, you're human too. And not in any kind of a self-pity way, but a way like, look at how Christ came into the world to us. I used to, I still teach a class down at the South Bend Center for the Homeless, and I would say to them, just think, if I could say to you guys, if I could rally you guys and say, this King of Kings is about to be born. He's going to be the great liberator. And this is going to free all of you from the shackles and the suffering and the misery that you're experiencing. And I could hype you up to believe. And then one day I came to you and I said, you see this? Come with me, come with me. And I walked you down under the viaduct to a cardboard box, and I show you this little girl born homeless on the streets, and said, here's the Messiah. That's what our Christian story is about. Could not have come into the world in a more vulnerable, broken way, to say that everybody is above this bar, every one of us. I think that our leadership does necessarily involve brokenness and vulnerability, not having all the answers, being a better listener than a talker, and these are all things that I need to work on. Fortunately, this comes very naturally to me, because my weaknesses far outweigh my strengths. My strengths are very limited, but being not afraid to share that. Don't put on airs. Everybody sees through that, but to be vulnerable, to be real, to be genuine. My predecessor, Bill Sexton, who was somebody I love and did this job here at Notre Dame for many years, he says final words of counsel to me. He goes, just be genuine. And if you do that, everything will work out just right. And I've thought about those words many times over the years.
So, one of the tensions, within that, and I think to talk about being genuine and being authentic is really at the core. And yet, in your position, you're always kind of talking to your team and really trying to raise bars, kind of raise money, kind of reach metrics that are given. I'm sure some of the people even listening are some of the people who work with you, and you have kind of high expectations for them. So it's easy to measure monetary achievements, goals, these kinds of things. At the same time, there are the questions of how you really treat people who have no money at all, and really how you
Right.
treat them with respect and dignity. So really, the next question really relates to impact.
Hmm.
And the question from one of our listeners is, where do you feel you've made the greater impact when you're at the top of an organization with scale for doing good, or working alongside people and accompanying them on the margins?
So, you know, the way I would say that is that, the way I would answer that is that mission or spirit of service or trying to lead a holy lifestyle. It's not about job description and it's not about geography. I know that firsthand that you could be the head of a homeless center and you could be a person who treats others harshly and wickedly. And I'm sure there were days that I fit that description. You could also be a high powered attorney on Wall Street and you could be the greatest presence of Christ in that world. Now, the challenge in being that high powered attorney in Wall Street, in my opinion, is we become who we run with. We're deeply influenced by the people that surround us, that we surround ourselves with. And, I know that when you're a recovering addict, when I worked at the homeless center, and if you're hanging around people who are still using, it's inevitable before you relapse and you begin to use yourself. The same thing is true if you surround yourself with people who are all about the pursuit, the climb to greater, what I describe as the three perennial temptations: power, prestige, and possessions. Where do most people in our society derive their self worth? From these statements: I am what I do, I am what I have, and I am what others say about me. If you surround yourself with people that are primarily about that pursuit, they will color your worldview and they will affect the decisions that you make. Instead, surround yourself with people that are on the margins, people that will pick you up when you fall, and people who will give you a swift kick in your butt when your head gets too big and you go off track. People that inspire you spiritually to lead what you know in your heart's desire, in your deepest corners of who you are, is right and true and everlasting. You surround yourself with those people, and good things will come of it, and you will help contribute to that good as well.
What keeps you grounded, Lou, as you really deal with these tensions? Because you are surrounded with a lot of people of influence and power and possessions and money and accomplishments. At the same time, you have this history and tradition, and it's easy to get lost in it for
Yeah.
any of us.
Just so you know, I am. If you talk to anybody who probably works in this division, be scary to think of what they might say about me. But one thing they would say is that we set very high goals, and I believe I think Father Ted said that God is never served well by mediocrity. And so I don't look at a spiritual life as some kind of passive, soft kind of way. It doesn't compromise a commitment to excellence. And we want to serve others as purely and as abundantly as we possibly can. But we also are committed to high levels of excellence in all that we do. We don't want to do anything, in mediocre ways. But how do you stay grounded in all of that? I think it's really important to maintain a prayer life. For me, my prayer life has evolved a lot. Over time, we pray as a family. I pray with the kids at night. We have 5 prayers that we say as we go to bed each night. And what I love about those is that as I do now, mostly with my 11-year-old, the youngest of the 5, is I'll say a line and she says a line, and we do the Hail Mary and then the Our Father, then the Glory Be, and then the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. But we go back and forth line after line the whole way through, and as we're falling asleep. And then I always ask, what's the one thing you're really thankful to God for? And to speak directly to God, not to me, but what it is, and who do you want to pray for? And then I always give them, and they give back to me, a sign of the cross on the forehead. And what I do is it started when they were really young, is I slap it in. I said, we're going to drive that cross in there. And so they're always, if I forget to slap them now, they're like, Dad, as we're falling asleep, that little slap thing is our kind of personal touch, and they'll give it back to me. We pray the rosary together, usually as a family during Lent. We've done that for many years, and now we pray it more for special occasions when we know somebody's going into a surgery or somebody's going through some friends, a difficult time. The iRosary that we had that you can get on your iPhone, what we do is we pass it around, and each kid leads a decade. And other people that visit us, we have other families that join us, and we do that on a regular basis. My own prayer life has evolved more to silence. And, I try to walk to work. I probably walk to work. It's 22 minutes door to door. And I try to walk to work in the morning, at the end of the day, most days, and not listen to any music, to not get on the phone or any email, but to just take the silence. But because I think the greatest threat to my spiritual life right now is busyness. I jump from this to this to this to this to this role, and when you're that busy, you don't hear God in the whisper of the wind. You don't hear that which is sacred within you and all around you, because your life is filled with too much noise. And so I just try to take that space to walk to work and walk back, where I'm not a part of my family, nor am I leading a work unit. I'm just in between. I'm in these liminal spaces, and it gives me a chance just to sense and feel the silence. And prayers will come under that, but it's more than anything else. It's just silence. It's just being.
Yeah. Well, Lou, thanks so much. That's a great note to end on. I think really just being quiet enough to listen to our hearts, paying attention to the questions and the desires that are there, being able to move beyond comfort zones and explore new territories and new zones, to become more committed to the values and inspirations that surface there. And then to keep asking, what does the world need? How can I respond? How can I keep growing? And how can I keep expanding into new spaces? So I think you've been, first of all, I want to thank you for all you've done to develop the university and to really make possible all kinds of opportunities for our students. And even to bring students here that otherwise would not be able to come here if you hadn't done your really hard work of making scholarships available and working with people to commit to the mission. So I want to thank you for your ongoing commitment to the mission, but also just who you are as a person deep down, and how you're a witness to who we can become and how we continue to grow in the Lord and in service to him and to his kingdom and to one another. And amidst all the tensions, just to become authentic and genuine. So Lou, thank you again for joining us and for sharing your story with us. And thank you all who are listening to our podcast. Just as a reminder, we will have Parker Palmer joining us next week, a wonderful author who's done tremendous work on the gift of being yourself. And he's a world-renowned author, and really it's a tremendous opportunity to be with him and to have a conversation with him next week. Remember, there are new episodes of our podcast that will launch every Thursday, and you can find us anywhere podcasts are found at our website, heartsdesiresocialchange.com. We hope that you can continue to join us as we journey to ask questions together and kind of find responses. I always like to repeat the words of John Donahue, the poet, who said, "The question holds the lantern," and these are just ways of finding further enlightenment as we ask them together. So if you want to deepen your experience with these ideas, join us in practicing as well our integration exercises, which are part of the podcasts. These integrations are actionable challenges to incorporate the content into our everyday life. And they're based on time-tested spiritual and psychological practices that correspond to the topic of each episode. This week, our episode is centered around themes of silence and solitude, which Lou just mentioned. And so these are some of the ways of practicing these different integrations each day. Also, please feel free to share this podcast with your friends. We're accepting registrations throughout the entire program, as each one of these meetings can really be separate and stand alone. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you can be with us next time. Greetings from under the dome. We hope you stay warm and hope you can join us next time.